These things happen. My name is Karen Stiller, and I'm a senior editor of Faith Today magazine, and you are a part of the EFC webinar on clergy wellness. Welcome. I'm going to say right off the top that I'm a minister's wife, and I have a lot of friends who are clergy. And so this is a topic I care a lot about, and we're very interested in it at the EFC, and you clearly are too because you've joined us. So we welcome your questions throughout the webinar, and there is an opportunity for you to send them in via the chat function on your screen. And we're going to decide as we go along whether we take them as they come or save some of them for the end. So just be patient, and we will get to them. So I'm going to welcome our guests today. We have two clergy wellness experts with us, Wanda Malcolm from Wycliffe College and Mark Vandervenen, sorry Mark, from Shalem Mental Health Network. In a moment, I'm going to turn the sort of speaking voices over to them. They are going to introduce themselves and sort of tell us how they are experts in this area, so you know who you're interacting with. I will ask them some questions, and then again, we invite you to send in yours. So, Wanda, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. You already know my name, and I think of all the things I could tell you about myself, probably the pertinent parts are that I'm a psychologist and I'm a professor at Wycliffe College, where my job is to help prepare people for ministry life. Probably the value of what I bring to today's conversation comes from the work I've done over the past several years, laying the groundwork for the Wycliffe Wellness Project. This is a long-term study of the ups and downs of ministry life. And in that context, I've spent many hours talking to clergy and listening to them describe both what they find most stressful and challenging about ministry life and what they find most satisfying, why they keep on showing up for ministry life, even though it indeed is stressful at times. Not sure if you want me to add anything to that.
No, that's great for now. Thank you, Wanda. When we come back to you, I'm going to ask you to speak even louder. You're probably speaking really loudly where you are, but I'm having a little trouble hearing you, so maybe others are too.
Okay.
But thank you. That was a great introduction. And now over to you, Mark.
Well, thanks, Karen and Wanda. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. So my background is I'm a marriage and family therapist and a social worker, and I've done that for over 25 years. And I serve now as the executive director of a place called the Shalem Mental Health Network, which is a Christian community-based mental health organization. And I've been there for about 10 years. Our main office is in Hamilton, Ontario, but we work across Ontario and even with some of our programs across Canada. But in that context, the unique issues I think that clergy go through have really become apparent to me. And so we were approached about 2009 by the folks at Emerge Ministries Canada, which was a clergy care program. And we were approached and asked to basically assume or take that program over, which we've done, and we call it Clergy Care. But its origin is with Emerge Ministries and Bill Moreau and his colleagues there. And so have been really concerned about the well-being of clergy, and we're really pleased that this opportunity presented itself. We have a couple of complementary programs that I might just quickly describe. One is called Faith Care, Faith Communities Affirming Restorative Experiences, and it's about healthy relationships in congregations. And the other is called the Congregational Assistance Plan, where a church can purchase for all of its members, including the pastor and their family, up to 6 counseling sessions in a year, anonymously and at no cost. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. So do you have your paths crossed before professionally then? It sounds like you're doing very similar work in some respects.
Just a little bit. I know that we've had a meeting in the past about clergy issues, but Wanda, I'm just getting to know you a little better now too.
Oh, good. Right. Well, who knows what will come out of this then? Wanda, with the Wycliffe Wellness Project, you're looking at some of the stresses, but you also, I think, deliberately said that you didn't say joy, but I'm going to say that word, the joys or satisfactions of clergy life. Can you give us maybe the top few things you're seeing in both those categories, the good and the bad, if I can be that simple about it?
Yes. Sure. So just to maybe clarify for the listeners, the project is both questionnaire and conversation based. So we start out by asking people to complete a set of questionnaires, and that's what I'm going to take this next information from. But then I go back to the people who participated and I have a conversation with them, because while the numbers give us an idea of what's happening, it doesn't tell us why.
Okay.
And so the conversations are hugely important. First, though, no surprise, there are stresses. Some of those stresses are unique to a given person or the context they're ministering in. What is also true, though, is that there are some that are almost universal. So, for example, around the stressors, the percentage of people who've participated in the project so far, who've listed things like managing their time, 86% of the people are saying that's a significant, or that's one of the biggest challenges of my ministry life. Interestingly, 84% of them are saying prayer is a major challenge for me. And this is intriguing, right? Part of that, now I can tell you from our conversations, part of that is because it's so important. And there's a distinct relationship between what they're saying about prayer and what they're saying about time. It's like, I don't have time to pray.
Okay.
It really, really matters to me, but I don't have time. And then they're saying things like, prayer is really important to me, so it's very unsettling when I don't feel motivated to pray. Or when I'm encountering spiritual dryness. It just, I'm there, I'm saying the words, and it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. So you can see that, and it makes sense, right? Something that meaningful will be quite distressing when it isn't working the way you want it to.
Wanda, can I just interject there? That reminds me of a couple of other stats I've read about pastors. Like there was a 2003 study where significant 71% did not feel spiritually affected while leading worship, and then another one about reading scripture personally didn't sort of move them or help them in the way it used to. So, so that you're seeing that as well, clearly.
Yeah, and I think that any one of us would say, "Oh, I've experienced that. Yes, it's really unsettling." But there's an additional layer for people who are holding positions in the church of leadership.
Yeah.
One of the things that some clergy have said to me is, it's bad enough that I'm going through a tough period with my prayer or my personal devotions. It's a whole other kind of difficult when the people I'm ministering to make comments that show that they assume this never happens to me.
Right.
That because I'm the minister, I'm different.
Yeah.
And who do I explore this with? Because my people want me to lead them, not tell them how difficult it is for me too.
Let me ask then, and Mark, please join in here, because I think, amongst the sort of clergy I know, they talk about those things more freely to their congregation in hindsight. Like they may share in a sermon, 5 years ago I went through this spiritual desert and here's what I learned. But at the time when it's happening, I think it would be very rare to have a pastor stand up and say, yeah, I actually don't believe this, this Sunday. So Mark, maybe you can speak into that. How are clergy vulnerable, and where is it safe to be vulnerable, and when?
Right, and I think you've really put your finger on a real issue for so many pastors, and I think it was echoed in what Wanda just noted too. For many pastors, they don't feel safe to be vulnerable or to show vulnerability. I'm not sure of another profession really where being vulnerable is such an actual occupational hazard. And so where can a pastor go for help? And that's been part of our experience at Clergy Care is pastors have expressed to us they don't feel safe going the usual routes, even for counseling somewhere, because they might be seen in public to be in a counselor's office by one of their church members or parishioners. And what would that do to their reputation as a pastor? And so, finding ways, safe ways to be vulnerable, to express, whatever they're going through that's difficult or challenging at that particular moment is an unusually difficult challenge for pastors. And I think churches do well to really provide that opportunity for pastors upfront and explicitly, with a message that we expect you to be going through things, and this is an avenue or avenues that we want you to use when you need them.
And do you know of churches like that, Wanda and Mark? I don't think I do. Maybe they're out there, but
I can't say that I do.
I don't. I can't either. I think some tend more in that direction.
Yeah.
But I don't know of one that's really explicit about it.
So how do we I want to get back to how clergy can care for themselves, but I think we're going in a good direction here about how churches can care for their clergy and leaders. So it feels like a big shift in church culture needs to happen to create that kind of environment you're talking about. And so what can a church do to make things a little better for their clergy?
Go ahead, Wanda.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of things, and they may sound like very small things, but I suspect they would have a bigger impact than we might imagine. One of them is for people in the church to be interested in their pastor as a person, just and to express their caring and interest in them as a person, and I'm not talking about being intrusive, but just remembering this is a real person who has a complicated life just like you do, and just as I would like to be asked, how am I doing? We can ask our pastors and be interested. The other thing is, it's a very simple thing, but find out when their day off is and don't call them on that day. Just respect their day off and their need for space to be rejuvenated and refreshed, to have their own Sabbath. And I mean, it's such a small thing, but wow, if everybody said, you know what, Pastor Joe is off on Mondays, and unless it's a real life and death crisis, I'm going to wait till Tuesday to ask them for pastoral care myself.
I may be about to open a big can of worms, and if there's anyone from my church listening, I'm not talking about you. But let me say that in our experience in clergy life, there are people who, and I think maybe at the beginning when we were also just figuring out boundaries, but they would think that your day off was actually the perfect time to call, because they would view themselves as friend and not work. And to me, that's one of the complications of clergy life and figuring out boundaries and not wanting to hurt people. And like, what should a minister say if someone does call them on their day off?
I think it's you've used the term boundaries, and I think that is crucial. I think a pastor needs to be firm in their boundaries, but also have the support of the church and the church governance behind them to say, this is my day off. We do need rest. A pastor in ministry is no good to anyone if they're burned out. And so pastors owe it to themselves to take a rest days off, and churches owe it to their pastors to assure, guarantee that that's going to be the case. So that another thing I think that's missing in a lot of churches, and you see it reflected in comments on surveys from pastors, is often churches have poor job descriptions or not even any actual job description, and also not the best governance structures. And so without a good job description as a pastor, you can be pulled in all kinds of directions because there are all kinds of expectations placed on you. And so that's a real recipe for burnout. And a good job description will also say, you know, these are times off that are critical, and as your governing authority, we're going to ensure that you get them.
Yeah, actually, that jives with a report that just came out recently from Lifeway Research, which I may not have that name correct, but anyway, it's an American firm, Lifeway Research, and they talked about sabbatical time, and to me that is a day off can be sort of a mini sabbatical, so time away, and also that clarity of role came up as an important thing that is good for clergy. But they said a lot of things that were, you know, a little disconcerting, like 84% of clergy who participated in this particular survey said they were on call 24 hours a day. 54% find the role of pastor frequently overwhelming. 21% say their church has unrealistic expectations of them. I actually thought that number would have been higher. 48% feel demands of ministry are more than they can handle. I'm going to guess that you two aren't surprised by those sorts of percentages.
I'm not, although when you mentioned that you thought the unrealistic expectations would be higher,
yeah,
I found myself, I'm not familiar with this study, but the first thing that jumped into my mind is, and what is the clergy person's expectations of him or herself? Are they too high?
That's good.
And the person doesn't know it because they haven't reflected on how much they're asking of themselves. And the idea that someone would be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years and years and years is staggering, right?
Yes.
And again, it comes back to boundaries. How do I have a conversation with my wardens or my elders or my board of deacons about how I change that, how I notify people of my day off, who do we have on call, who would be able to sift and sort and call me if I really was needed.
Yes.
But otherwise, I'm off or I'm not on call.
Has there been research done on sort of if there are certain types of people who go into ministry? Like, are there people more or less inclined to believe they need to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?
I don't know of explicit research, but Wanda, you may. Are you familiar with any?
No. I mean, there's lots and lots of. One of the things when I was getting ready to do my research, I did a lit review, and there's all kinds of correlational studies that link personality and burnout, or right? Not so much who's called into ministry, their personality, but you keep seeing patterns in the research. And a really kind of sensible one is that people enter ministry because they feel called to it, and it taps into their need to do meaningful work, their need to be needed. For some of those people, that's going to be at a problematic level. Not everybody, maybe not even most, but for a subset of people, that's going to tap into a real, maybe an unhealthy level of need to be needed.
How about the stats we hear about clergy, and I think I've read the same statistic about clergy spouses, that the rate of depression is significantly higher than the general population. Is that true? And this is all getting very depressing, actually, so we should give us some positives here. If that is the case, again, I guess the solution is within the person. I mean, I know depression is another animal, but as well as the church, how can we help with that?
Do you want to take that one, Mark? Or?
Well, I think along some of the same lines that Wanda and I have already been saying. I do think, it's actually truthful to say that being a pastor, at least in Canada today, is itself a risk factor for depression. And that's a very sobering thing to say. But there are ways to deal with it. And it has to do with, as Wanda was talking about, supporting your pastor as a person.
Yeah.
Allowing them and their family to have a life outside of the church. Allowing them to access support when they need it. Being clear about boundaries and roles. One of the best things a church can do to support a pastor is to actually be relationally healthy themselves as a church. Because conflict can really tear a pastor apart. And so how do we do relationships in this congregation? And can we be clear and explicit about that? Can we be healthy? I wonder, Karen, if I could mention in our experience at Clergy Care, so over the last 3 years, we've worked with about 60 clergy households, pastors and their families. And it's a little interesting, the presenting issues that come forward. And the top 4 are anxiety, couple issues, stress, and trauma. I think in terms of couple issues, one of the real challenges for clergy couples is what we were talking about earlier, that pastors often feel they're on call 24/7. And so you sometimes hear language like, you're married to your church, right? Or are you married to me? And so for a pastor to be able to be clear about their loyalties and establish that clearly can be really helpful.
Yeah.
But anxiety, stress, trauma, either current or past trauma, all of those things seem to bubble up to the surface, at least in the work that we're doing.
Let me ask about the term burnout and clergy who perhaps leave the ministry over some of those reasons. Like, are there sort of patterns of clergy burnout that you are seeing, or sometimes do people just need to take a break and then re-engage?
Maybe I could speak to that just briefly. Yeah. I've got in front of me the Duke Clergy Health Initiative, which is and I want to say to begin with, it's a study of United Methodist clergy in North Carolina. So small group of people, and we need to be cautious about assuming it's true for everybody everywhere. But they are saying that. So I'm just going to read this. Clergy show burnout rates similar to, and sometimes better than, other helping occupations. Mm-hmm. So it's important to remember that it's an occupational hazard for anybody who spends a lot of time working with people, particularly people who are suffering, who are going through difficult times, and who are calling on this other person for support and assistance through a difficult time. Mm-hmm. But clergy are doing, they're reporting about the same levels, and sometimes a little bit better than other professions. The other thing that's really interesting is that there's a difference between full-time and part-time, which in some ways makes sense, right? If you're if you're not spending all of your time in the church. What's interesting is for the part-time folks, they have more questions about personal effectiveness, and for the full-time folks, they have more issues around just being emotionally exhausted or starting to be negative and cynical towards the people they minister to. Yeah. So there's complexities in there, right? For sure, they're at. I guess the important thing is they're at risk because of their vocation, because of their calling, not because of the kind of person they are.
Yes. Okay, let me pick up on something there. First of all, I should say that the burnout question was from someone who's listening and participating in the webinar. So just to encourage folks that you are certainly welcome to send in your questions, and we'd love to see them. In terms of the occupational hazard part, how can seminaries, and Wanda, you are at a seminary, graduating people who are going to go into the life, what to expect and how to prepare themselves better, perhaps.
So I'm sorry, Karen, I lost part of what you said.
Sorry. I'm wondering how seminaries can prepare future pastors better, knowing that there are these occupational hazards.
Right. So at the risk of sounding self-congratulatory, which I don't tend to do, one of the things I do at Wycliffe is I teach a course that is required for the MDiv students, and it's called Boundaries and Bridges, Care of Self for Care of Others.
Mm-hmm.
And we spend a semester talking about self-awareness and self-knowledge. I mean, know yourself. Who is it you're taking into ministry?
Mm.
What are your strengths? What are your liabilities?
Mm-hmm.
What do you need to learn more about in order to be better able to navigate the vocational waters?
That's good.
And we talk about, so there's units that are around boundaries. We talk about boundaries. We talk about working with your own and other people's strong emotions. We talk about conflict and conflict response styles. Do you know how you reflexively respond to conflict without even thinking? This is your go-to response. What's your relationship with time? How do you use time? Do you, like money? Are you a saver? Are you really, really careful with your time, or do you splurge, or do you, and how? What do you say yes to? And is there anything that you say no to? And how do you do that gracefully when you decide that it's important? So I'm not aware of another seminary that teaches a dedicated course to these kinds of things. I do know that seminaries talk about it a lot. It's more embedded in the pastoral courses. But I actually think there's something quite important about saying, no, we actually need to do this explicitly to help our people, help equip our people for what they're going to encounter out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple. Sorry, Mark. We do have a couple questions that I'd like to read from participants. Does this concern about burnout for pastors relate to the inability to be honest about the personal challenges that they face? And just a comment that it'd be nice if churches and clergy could just be more graceful toward each other, perhaps. So I guess coming back to that idea of not being able to be transparent or not feeling that you can be.
Maybe I can go at that a little bit this way. I love what Wanda just said about her program there, because I think pastors are actually first responders. They're in the group of first responders, like police and like family doctors, for example. They're often the first point of access for help for people who are in crisis. Where it might be an addiction, it might be a marital crisis, it might be a teenager who's cutting, it might be someone who's suicidal. And that sense of self-awareness that Wanda just described is so important for anyone who's a first responder. And what alarms me and gets me concerned about the pastor's role is all other first responders have mechanisms for debriefing, for talking about how this particular incident triggered something for them and being able to work it through. But for pastors, there is this issue where it's not safe to reach out that way, or they experience it that way anyways. And so those very intense, difficult things that come from being part of very serious, emotional, critical situations, where do you go with them? And it's really important to the role of a first responder that you be able to go somewhere and express yourself, and increase your own sense of self-knowledge about who you are and what your triggers are and what your gifts are.
Can I share something I've observed amongst groups of clergy? That, like, I'm thinking of ministerials. Like, Mark, when you were speaking, I thought, well, maybe another minister could understand. And I'm picturing the ministerials we see in cities and towns. And but my observation after a while, or not having spoken for a while, I don't find that they're often necessarily real with each other even. That often there's, somebody says, well, what's your average Sunday attendance?
Right.
And they sort of get it. I don't know. I'm like,
Right.
I'm wondering again, who people can be real with. Maybe it's the Marks and the Wandas of the world. Maybe it is at that professional counseling level if people don't have a really good friend.
I also think that part of what's happening here, I wonder if it would make a difference if clergy knew that they're not the only ones who struggle with their prayer life. No, they're not the only clergy.
Yes.
And that some of it is education, and it's broad, being informed, right? It would make a huge difference to me if I were an ordained person, if I knew that the person to my left and the person to my right at a ministerial probably was also struggling. Who felt unsettled and distressed when they had questions about how they're living out their calling, and that they weren't going to look at me like there was something wrong with me because I'm having challenges with it. And I think it does go back to the earlier question about burnout. If I don't have a place where I can talk, where it's safe and where other people are going to get me, like they're there too doing the same kinds of things, and we're more similar than we are different. Yeah. I think if you don't have those people to talk to, you got to do it by yourself, and you're going to be more at risk for burning out. But I do think that's one of the values of the kind of research studies that I'm doing and that we've been referencing today, is just somehow get that information to clergy and say, you know what? It's like this for a lot of people. Yeah. You're not alone in your experience of this. At some point, Karen, I'd like to loop back around and talk about the positives.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if it's right now, but let's not lose
that.
Well,
let me make one comment on what you just said, and then maybe bring in a couple of other questions, and then I think definitely let's head in that direction. As you were speaking, Wanda, I was thinking that my experience as a clergy spouse has been that it really only takes one person courageous enough to be honest, in a group or in a conversation. And then typically I have found that gives the other people permission to say, yeah, I'm like that too, or I have that problem as well. So I think you're right. That's absolutely right. It can be that simple. That has been my experience with it. Someone has asked a pretty specific question, and it has to do with money, actually, which is something I wanted to ask. This is a little different. When congregation members go through issues of family financial crisis, how can pastoral first responders react well? What boundaries do we need to draw? So that's a real sort of rubber hits the road question, I guess, pretty specific, but I'm sure in today's Canada that's a typical issue that pastors see within their congregations. Mark, do you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more, maybe what's behind that around the role question. But I know in my community we have a Christian person who is trained as someone who does financial planning with people, low income or whatever. And I would be looking for others in the community who have that sort of expertise that you could refer to. And then you can keep your pastoral role, but hopefully they can be getting some of the help that they want and need.
That's good advice, yeah. And that's something that I watched my husband learn over the years, is that he can refer.
Right.
refer to people who know better than he what they're doing.
Which is part of the body of Christ. We all have gifts, and so let's let those gifts be expressed.
Absolutely. Another participant is asking about this topic of relational health that we mentioned earlier. And just seeing that it's a big problem when there's not relational health in a congregation. and I guess how that is best encouraged, and that perhaps it shouldn't actually be taught by the pastor, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
So are there like workshops we can bring in?
Right.
I know Willow Creek Canada does something on how to have crucial conversations that I have found helpful, but are there people who can come in and
I lost you there for a minute, Karen.
Yeah.
But we do that.
Okay.
We do lots of workshops with churches and trainings in how to deal with conflict, but how to be relationally healthy congregations. One of the things we talk about is encouraging churches to become conflict-friendly congregations.
That's good.
Where conflict is not seen as something that's negative, but as an invitation to deeper relationship.
Right.
And if there are explicit practices for this is how we do conflict and this is how we do relationship, it can actually function that way.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, sometimes pastors try to suppress conflict that they see simmering in a congregation because they can sometimes feel like that's the peacemaking thing to do. Whereas in fact, having conflict come out in the open and having it then be dealt with in a safe but effective way can really deepen everyone's experience, not only of each other, but even of the faith and God. So.
Yeah, thank you. Let me ask one last question from a participant, at least for now, and then go back to some of the good things you're learning, Wanda. The question is, do we pay clergy enough? And I'd like to broaden that out a little bit and say that I remember a few times early on in my life as a clergy spouse sort of sharing with other wives, in this case, whose husbands had busy careers, but their husbands were, doctors or surgeons or something, that they were able to go on great vacations, and I was very jealous, and I confess that. But I remember thinking, oh yeah, that would be better. Like that would make things easier if we could, go out to a restaurant or whatever. Like just those sort of comforts of life, those kind of rewards for hard work, say, which, especially when you're young clergy and you maybe have student loans from seminary and all that stuff. So I'm wondering if financial woes play a part in this.
Wanda, I'm curious if you've done some of that research in some of your research with pastors' conversations.
Well, for sure, financial issues can be a stressor. They interestingly, they aren't high on the list. Right? So they're not, so they're there, but I think so one of the things that I can say about money is that it has no capacity to be a satisfier. It only has the capacity to be a dissatisfier when there's not enough. And so if people are reasonably okay with the financial realities they're living in, it just never makes it on the list of this is what's good about my ministry life. I make enough money. It's only going to make it on the list if it's not enough. So if you looked at that, you'd say, well, it's not enough because there it is on the negative, but it's never on the positive. But money just doesn't have the capacity to be a satisfier.
Yeah, which we all learn eventually, right?
It's the things that you can access because you have money that are the satisfiers. And I think there's a related issue, and that is that very few churches have a job description for their pastor. And so there's no way in which the pastor can say, I have done my work today and I have done enough. Because I know that what I'm supposed to do is this, this, and this, and I've done it. And so the pastor is the victim of whoever speaks loudest about what they didn't do enough of. Right? And also that much of what they do, their congregants don't even know that they're doing it. So this is a little anecdotal thing. I remember a very good friend who's been a lifelong churchgoer being puzzled about why I was studying clergy, stress, and wellness, because like they only preach on Sundays, right? and I was just kind of like, after I picked my chin up off the table, it was like, you know what? A lot of it is invisible.
Yeah.
If you're only in church on Sunday, you have, and I'm not making any judgments about that, but just it brought home to me a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Much of what the pastor does is invisible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the people deciding how much money they're going to give to the church may be basing it on what they think they should be giving for the Sunday service. And then it's not going to be enough.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. That joke, because often it is a joke about just working on Sunday, that should be like against the law. As we start to wind down, we had one other question come in, which I'll just ask you both to just weave it into your final comments, and that is how churches can better show appreciation for their clergy and just express that love. So I'll ask you to hold that in the back of your mind as you speak. So Wanda, let's go back to you and your what the good things you are discovering in your research, and just the blessings of living the clergy or church leadership life. Can you share some of that?
So one of the things I want to say is that I think is unique about the project, the Wycliffe Wellness Project, is we're actually asking people, tell us what you're doing that is most positive, and how often do you get to do that? So there are many things that clergy are commonly finding really positive. The highest amongst that is profoundly common sense. I have the opportunity every day to live out my calling. That's what I get up and do. That's what it's about. And how many of us, lots of us get to say that, but how many of us think of it in those terms, right? Also, that worship is woven into the fabric of their lives. That's a strong satisfier. The sense of being aligned with God, that I'm moving in step with God, and then that I get to integrate who I am as a person with what I believe, and I have to keep on working on it, and it's really satisfying that that's part of what I do. So we're finding out lots of things: building community, helping other people develop, the opportunity to preach, to speak out loud our convictions about who God is, and so there's all kinds of meaningful engagement that clergy get to do every day, and that's why they show up, right, in spite of the stress. And I think, in answer to your question, the one you said to weave in is, when you're sitting in the pews, pay attention to that and affirm your pastor. When you see them doing really, their sermon has really touched you, let them know. Tell them that it really got you thinking, and you're so grateful that they spoke about it. Or right? So affirm them, so that they know that indeed they are walking in step with God and they are living out their calling. The other thing I want to point out, and it is turning out to be a really interesting puzzle for me to think about as I'm doing the research, there's a big difference in how negatively people are rating the things they find stressful and how positively they're rating the things they find satisfying. The positive is way more highly rated than the negative. So what's positive is really positive, and what's negative is negative, but not as negative as the positive is positive. If that makes sense.
Surprisingly, it does.
And so what I'm coming to understand is it isn't the stress itself that is the problem. It's the relationship between the stress and satisfaction. Which way do the scales tip? Is it heavier on the satisfaction end, so it's offsetting or creating a reservoir to draw from on those bad days and in those tough moments? or is the person trying to draw from an empty well?
Yeah.
They're trying to cope with the stress when there's nothing to offset it. Now they'll be in trouble if the latter is true.
Yeah. Thank you, Wanda. Mark, how do clergy make sure that well is full then? And then I'll sort of wrap us up.
Yeah, I think self-care is really important. It's important in any helping profession. So things like physically being active is really helpful. Making sure you take time off, making sure you have time for your family, having those clear boundaries in place, and you know where your true loyalties sort of lie. You asked about how churches can support pastors. I agree with Wanda about affirmation is huge. You know, compliment your pastor, but also back that up with structures that for the care of your pastor. So you know that being a pastor is going to be stressful, and so as a church, you're committed to providing support for the pastor, because even outside the church, because as a church, you know that the pastor's needs can't all be met through the church. And then I would also encourage, as a church, pay attention to the spiritual needs of your pastor and your pastor's family. So, you know, for a pastor's spouse and kids, who actually are their pastor? And, you know, maybe your pastor could be set up with a spiritual director, for example, just to help with their own spiritual walk. So anyway, concrete, tangible things like that show a pastor, we care about you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both. And I would just echo that again as a clergy spouse, that those sort of, you know, words of affirmation and practical support are just huge, really. And also just the joys and the wonder and the privilege of clergy life they're all very real too. So I'm so glad we touched on those things. It's easy with a topic like clergy wellness to dwell on unwellness. so hopefully I won't say that we were balanced, but I think we touched a little bit on both. So that's great. For the questions that we didn't directly answer, there were a couple on resources. Let me tell the participants that we are going to send out an email to all of you with a few links, including to Shalem Mental Health Network and to the Wycliffe Wellness Project, that we think you will find helpful. So if we didn't address your question directly, it's probably because we knew that I didn't know the answer if it was about a resource, but we're going to look that up for you and send that out to you. So please watch for that email. I want to mention a couple of things. Faith Today, the magazine that I work with that is published by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, is running a very unique and pleasant contest right now where we're inviting congregations across the country to nominate their pastor to win a few days away at a spiritual retreat center. We have these wonderful centers from across the country who are partnering with us. So I encourage you to check that out. And if you're a pastor, just send the link to someone. faithtoday.ca/contest. We also, as a thank you for participating in the webinar, invite you to subscribe to Faith Today at 50% off between now and 5 p.m. We'll close that link down at 5, and that is faithtoday.ca/webinar. You will find that great deal. We also have 2 other webinars coming up in February on euthanasia and a part 2 on palliative care, and you'll find information about those on the EFC website, which is efc.ca. And finally, I just want to thank you, Wanda and Mark, so much for giving us your time today and your expertise. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and it's certainly been encouraging. And we know this is an important, essential topic, and you know, maybe we'll have to do this again. I'm thinking that we should. So thank you very, very much, and thank you for joining us, everyone, and please join us again another time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.